Live from Midtown Manhattan, TheCube's live coverage of Big Data NYC, a SiliconANGLE Wikibon production. Made possible by Hortonworks, We Do Hadoop, and WANDisco. Hadoop made invincible. And now your co-hosts, John Furrier and Dave Vellante.
Hi everybody, we're back. This is Dave Vellante of Wikibon with Jeff Kelly. We're here at Big Data NYC, which is our event that we are holding this week. This is our third day. We're down here on 6th Ave at the Warwick Hotel right across the street from the Hilton, where Hadoop World and StrataConf are going on. Adam Fuchs is here. He's the CTO of Squirrel, a longtime CUBE guest, individual who's done a number of great spots with us. We did one at the Wikibon offices, which we're going to talk a little bit about today because that was the subject of one of his breakout talks. Adam, welcome back to theCUBE.
Thanks, Dave. Good to be here.
Yeah, so you evidently had a packed house. We were talking to some of the folks at the CUBE party last night, and evidently they were standing room only to your session on big data lessons learned at the NSA. Everybody wants to hear about that. Now, of course, you couldn't give the real inside scoop, but still, you provided, I'm sure, frameworks as you did in the video that we did with you. So how did it go?
Yeah, so I think everybody was expecting me to divulge some secrets. Most people were disappointed, but no, it was definitely a packed house. I think we counted something like 400 people in, which I don't know, probably violates fire code. Good session, a lot of interest afterwards. So I think people are really getting into big data security, right? Try to fix all that stuff.
Well, it's certainly been a talk of this conference, and it really started to escalate, I don't know, maybe about a year ago, but really started to escalate kind of around last summer, I noticed. We saw you at Hadoop Summit, and the talk around security really started to grow. Now, maybe that's because everybody really started to have some kind of solution to bolt on to their existing infrastructure. You guys always make the case that you had to start from scratch. So, and that's really what Accumulo was all about. It was developed inside the NSA. Somehow, you guys got it open sourced, which is
that was quite an effort.
Amazing, right? And,
yeah, funny thing though is that open sourcing software from government and from behind the other side of the wall, it's not that hard. The hard part is actually continuing to participate in the project afterwards. Right? So we actually went through about a year of policy writing in order to just get the right structures to maintain that participation from folks that are actively working on top secret missions and still.
Right, because they want to put them in a closet and not let them out, right?
Yeah.
So
there have been a few projects that have kind of been thrown over the fence, stuck on GitHub, and there's a lot of good tech out there that nobody will, I don't know.
Well,
comes
we talk a lot here. I mean, when we started Wikibon, we had, I said earlier today, we were inspired. One of the many inspirations was Don Tapscott's book on Wikinomics. Put it out there, and great things will happen. People will pick up on it. Now, again, government sometimes doesn't want that to happen, but the flip side of that is innovation happens when you open source things. So.
Yeah, and as a startup, it's actually pretty tricky for us to decide where do we do open source and where do we do closed source. At some point, you got to figure out how you're going to make money, but also how you're going to innovate and how you're going to really rally a larger development community than just your own team.
Right. So now you're also seeing some others hop on the Accumulo bandwagon, not necessarily just through Squirrel, but also say, hey, Accumulo, yeah, we'll support Accumulo, and Hortonworks do that.
A small company like Cloudera,
yeah.
You may have heard of them.
Yes.
Yeah, they just announced support for that. Hortonworks is very active in the development as well. So we're getting a lot of great players out there. And of course, there's still a huge amount of funding that comes in through government contracts. If you go, pay attention on the lists, you'll see lots of people chiming in that have various projects on Accumulo. We're trying to bring that much more into the private sector outside of government space. Get a lot more participation from folks in regulated industries like healthcare, banking. Huge potential for solving the security problems that are out there.
So talk a little bit about some of the lessons learned. I mean, again, I know you can't divulge super secrets, but things around scale and just security practices in general, and dealing with diverse data sets and utilizing a key value store. What are some of the things that you talked about in your session and you talked about in the video that we did together?
Yeah. So the core axiom behind all of these lessons learned is that really application development is key for innovation in any kind of organization. And by that I mean, if you can take an idea and encapsulate that in an application that then can be used and can be adopted by a large organization, that application is sort of that nugget of innovation. The more you can do that, the more rapidly you can build applications, the faster you can innovate. So a lot of these lessons learned, we're talking about how do we avoid barriers to innovation. And the core of the Hadoop community is really focused on that as well. So you've got Hadoop pushing for scalability as a central tenet of the overall infrastructure. You do that because you don't want to hit a point somewhere in the adoption curve where you're not going to have the ability to scale beyond that. Right? So that ability to just continue to scale seamlessly from start to finish, that's one of those core ideas.
What kind of questions did you get from the audience? I mean, that you could share with us?
Yeah, so
or that you can answer.
Everybody's interested in what's the difference between Accumulo and HBase. Right, we get a lot of questions on that.
Oh, okay, interesting. Okay, well, let's talk about that. I mean, you and I have talked about that, but it's worthwhile reviewing. Right, so
the two projects actually started around the same time, although Accumulo was a closed source project inside of the government for the first few years of its life. It's an interesting discussion for two reasons, and it's one of those is that the two projects actually have pretty different focuses, despite being both based off of the Google Big Table design from the beginning. So Accumulo started out really trying to focus on very heavy ingest rates, and as such, you can see a lot of design decisions made both in the client libraries and the networking code and the compaction algorithms that are backing all of the performance on the server side, versus HBase, which very much had a focus on providing low latency query response times, and certainly in 2011 it was ahead on most of those metrics. So you kind of see a co-evolution of the two projects, but now, since they're sitting side by side in the Apache Software Foundation, you get actually a lot of code sharing and a lot of idea sharing between the two projects. So I think it's actually very healthy to have the two projects sitting side by side. Now, our position at Squirrel is that Accumulo still has those core security and scalability features that distinguish it, certainly in all of the use cases that we're using it.
Well, the race is on, right? So
the race is.
You get people talking about putting cell-level security into HBase. You guys have said, okay, it's cool, but see if it performs like you need it to perform.
Yeah, I'd love to have some point in the future where we can take our Squirrel software and port it over to HBase and have that not be an issue anymore.
Yeah, you would love to do that, right? Of course.
The architecture is great underneath the big table design and the systems built off of that. A lot of strengths. The battle shouldn't be amongst the minute differences between the two systems. Yeah. Right now, the security kind of makes it a pretty big differentiator.
Well, so kind of a related question. We talked earlier today with Jack Norris from Appar, and he made a point about in the Hadoop space, it's pretty much Hadoop has emerged really as that de facto standard for a big data platform. The foundational level anyway. But the NoSQL role is much more up in the air. He put up a slide, I think, in one of his keynotes with I don't know how many logos of different NoSQL databases. So obviously, Squirrel is betting on Accumulo, but in your opinion, what is it going to take for one or two or three of these NoSQL databases to kind of win the market, if you will? I mean, or maybe is the premise of my question right? Can they all survive? How do you see this kind of playing out, and what are some of those keys that are going to differentiate the NoSQL databases that do thrive from the ones that kind of fade away?
Yeah, well, it's almost certain that the ultimate NoSQL database doesn't exist yet, right? But what we're seeing is that there seems to be some consolidation of the various systems into maybe 4 different categories. You've got your hash-based key value stores. You've got your sorted key value stores, which also have some columnar capabilities. You've got document stores like MongoDB, which have the most market share now in the NoSQL space. And then I'd also throw in a lot of the graph stores into that category as well. But if you start looking across them, you can bring in some defining characteristics of NoSQL that sort of separate it from SQL. things like low latency, high concurrency, denormalized models of data. All of those elements, we see commonalities across all of the different systems. One of the things that we're trying to do with Squirrel is to minimize that interface perspective as to choosing which database to use under the covers. So we're trying to bring in document features and graph features, storing those on Accumulo side by side with a sorted key value, which gives you a huge feature set. And from the perspective of supporting that low latency, high concurrency query interface with the denormalized models, we can do pretty well across all of those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in terms of, you mentioned earlier partnership with Cloudera, and so what's the impact of a partnership like that in terms of, do you see as the Hadoop world kind of and the NoSQL worlds collide a little bit more, and you're seeing more support from people like Cloudera and others, how is that impacting the kind of the NoSQL market?
Yeah, so from us, from our perspective in particular, we have a lot of different areas where we need to focus our development. Some of those are on things like security and the security ecosystem, building in policy engines, and ties into identity and access management systems. Huge amount of work over there. Some of them are in doing analytic layers and making sure that we have things like documents and graphs and live updates and graph neighborhood searches, and maybe sketching algorithms and approximations. And then there's sort of the other part, which underlies everything, which is infrastructure, core infrastructure, and enterprise readiness. I'm pretty excited about folks like Cloudera coming in because they're going to be contributing to these open source sub-projects, things like replication across multiple data centers that really solidify that core. And we need to have that.
Right.
We can do that ourselves. I'd much rather focus on these other elements and partner on keeping that stuff in the open source, that core open source database.
Yeah. So really focus on what you do best and where your real value proposition is, and kind of let partner rather than try to do it all yourselves.
Yeah.
In other words,
nobody can succeed doing everything themselves.
So let's geek out a little bit. So what are some of the innovations you're working on now that you can share, to the extent that you can share, that you're excited about, things you're looking to add to Squirrel Analytics, the platform, and Accumulo, the database?
Yeah, so one of the things that we put in our latest release is an ability to do online aggregation in a document model. So you can have a field in a document where you can update that field, and the effect of updating that field is to add to the value, to contribute to the value that was there before. Right, and this is a pretty simple concept, right? Maybe you read the previous value, you increment it, you write it back. We're doing it in a different way. And Accumulo, under the covers, has this thing called the iterator tree, which basically supports doing that type of increment operation, giving consistent results, so you always get the same response to your query, but doing it in a way that doesn't involve read, modify, write. So if I'm randomly updating a whole bunch of values throughout my database, and I have to read the previous value at each of them to do that random update, all of my operations are going to turn into random IOPS in my core storage, which tends to be spinning disk. Right. You don't want to do that, right? You want to batch things up in micro batches and basically be able to do the aggregations efficiently. So we're taking that, we're exposing that at a pretty high level inside of the documents. Part of what we're working on is really extending that to where it's, you can have weights on graph edges that have those types of aggregate functions, but also extending the types of aggregate functions that we support. So a lot of people are really interested in monoids and sketching algorithms. Google published a paper on hyperlog-log cardinality estimation.
Just a little easy Sunday reading.
Let me go a little bit into it. So basically, limited memory footprint, but get a pretty good estimate for things like counts across huge data sets. So if I take 10 petabytes of data and I want to figure out what's in that, I can have a series of sketches that that tell me what's in that, and I can store those sketches in a much smaller footprint than the original data, as long as I can keep them up to date online. And that's what we're really building in, to our document and graph models.
You were talking before about some of the problems with spinning disk. Do you see the advent of flash memory changing some of the unnatural acts that you had to do as a developer, and actually maybe obviating some of the cool things and tricks that you used?
That's actually something that we've looked at a lot over the last several years. Is this data going to be, or is this database technique going to be obsolete? And generally, if you look at the data structures that are optimal for storing things on something like an SSD, they're pretty similar to the log structure merge tree technology that backends Accumulo. So you still want to do batching, right? Because a lot of that has to do with synchronization and how do you efficiently use your threads in your processors. Yep. And it also has to do with how do you efficiently compress data, right? So how do you reduce the relative entropy between two different data elements? So grouping things into batches, doing a log structure merge tree, still going to be efficient in the SSD and in-memory world. And we're pretty excited because it's going to give us 10 times better performance as well.
Yeah, so the techniques you've chosen have legs, and it's going to give you better performance. And the gap, what gives you confidence that the gap you have now in terms of security, scalability, and all the other benefits of Accumulo, that you can maintain that gap as all this other competition comes into the marketplace?
Well, I don't think those elements of the database really change. I mean, you still have to worry about how do you model that security, how do you keep track of the fine-grained attributes that affect who can see an individual record. And I think in the domains that we're talking about, we're pretty far ahead.
Because it's fundamental to what you've developed.
It is fundamentally, yeah. I mean, in-memory techniques are great, but you still have to have the right algorithms, and the data-centric security model in general is still the right one.
Yeah, great. All right, Adam, thanks again for coming onto theCUBE. Always a pleasure to listen to you get deep. And check out the Chalk Talk that Adam did. It's called Big Data Lessons Learned at the NSA. If you go to Squirrel's website, you can see it. You got you got to give your name, address kind of thing, or you can just Google it and you'll find it somewhere, but it's really good. So check that out. You got a few videos up there, actually, that you did that were really helpful.
We've done 4 so far.
It was awesome.
So kick off some more.
Really learned a lot doing those, and I go back every now and then and review them, and they're quite useful. So for the practitioners out there that just want some good advice on how to structure things, it's worth hitting the Squirrel website, or like I say, hit the SiliconANGLE YouTube page. Okay, Adam, thanks very much for coming on. Jeff Kelly, thank you for hanging in there with me. And this is theCUBE. We're right back. We're live from NYC, Big Data, New York City. We'll be right back.